Okay. Yeah, hello there, everyone. It's the top of the hour. Good morning, good day, good afternoon, good evening. Looks like we got people from across the world, as always, so good to see. I'm going to lower everyone's hand here. If you have questions, please put them in the chat. We've got a lot of people, so we're not going to open this up freeform. If you do have questions, we will repeat them in the chat. Super exciting lineup for everyone today. And let's see, so intro, that's going to be by me, Chris Fregley. This is going to be by Antje. Actually, this is going to be me also. This will be Antje Bart from Germany, and this is going to be Luigi Petruno. So we have all these folks on the line here today. Quick introduction. So I'm Chris Fregley, developer advocate for AI and ML at AWS. We also have Antje Bart on the phone. Antje, do you want to say hi?
Yes, sure. Hi, everyone. So yeah, I'm Antje. I'm gonna present today on a special topic, just 5 minutes, building a chatbot. So excited to show you what we've done here in the last couple of days.
Yeah, it's pretty cool. We actually pulled this together. I had done a presentation last week that I posted. We'll post all these links in the chat here as we get to them, but called Scaling a Workshop, both online and offline. Some best practices from the monthly workshop that we do. This is really the kind of predecessor. So this monthly webinar actually kind of precedes. So Saturday we're actually doing a full day workshop. We're also actually doing one tonight, I guess, relative to Pacific time. That'll be more of the APAC and Australia region. So if you're not familiar with that, we could post those links here in a bit. But I have some best practices on how to scale these workshops. We have, hundreds and hundreds of people on these workshops, actually thousands. In some cases, we've built some best practices. Oh, and then also, yeah, real quick, we have Luigi on the line. Yeah, Luigi, do you want to say hello and introduce yourself?
And Luigi, you.
Yeah, Luigi, I think if you have your iPods or the AirPods in, those usually make that sound. Can you fix your audio? Yeah, it sounds cool for sure. You sound like yeah, Darth Vader.
How about now?
Yeah, perfect.
Okay, sorry about that. I think when
Yeah, was it the AirPods?
Back to robot.
Back to robot sound. Okay, so yeah, try to stabilize that, Luigi. Let's keep moving forward. And it sounds like club music. Yeah, it sure does. All right, so simplify that situation, Luigi, and I'm gonna do some quick intros. So Antje, could you, if you have some of the links for tonight's, I think it's the AI Camp one, could you post those in the, and then let me get Saturdays here. Okay. Get the, 1 second. And then also I want to get I had to reboot right before because I was seeing some weird things here on my machine. So, okay, so, quick intros, which we just did, meetup updates, cranking along. We've got up to, thousands of people joining the workshop, which is really great. And here's some of these best practices. So let me quickly go through this. So 15 tips to scale a large workshop. And actually, At the end, Luigi's going to share some experiences with his workshop and share links to his workshop that he just launched, I believe, yesterday. Saw an email. So super excited to hear more about that. Quick background too about Luigi. He is part of the SageMaker community. We've known him. Oh, yeah, still a little bit robot. Yeah, we've known Luigi for I think better part of a year. I actually saw him speak at a pretty high profile conference here in the Bay Area. He's based out of New York and just had a baby, so congratulations on all that. And okay, so 15 tips to scale a large workshop. So you can see the number of these attendees over the last few months. We really had to lay the groundwork. This is a SageMaker workshop with KubeFlow. And so there's the main link, datascienceonaws.com. If you click on that link actually, or just type that into your browser, you'll be able to get to all of the workshops and all of our GitHub repos. Antje and I are also working on a book called the same name, Data Science on AWS. So pretty excited about that. And you can see we've actually made quite an impact here. So people before the workshop weren't really too sure about using AWS for AI and machine learning. And then afterward, these are going, yes, these numbers go up. We saw, I believe, about a 20 to 30% lift because of the workshop. So we continue to track and had some good feedback from the community here. This person stayed up till 6 in the morning their time. This tweet, I think this tweet came from Antje, so it was 1 a.m. her time when the workshop ended. So our goal for the rest of the year is to expand to more time zones and to bring this to more folks around the world. Tip number 1, cannot stress this enough, find a trustworthy buddy. And the 2 other sets of people here are actually people from Amazon Web Services that have also found good partners. We got the Scotch brothers in the upper right there. We have Gabe and Nikki in the upper left doing lots of Twitch streams. We tend to stay on YouTube and use Zoom for things just to make it more accessible. But one tip is to alternate. So don't try to do this alone. Try to find a buddy and you can alternate between speaking and live question answering. So while I'm speaking, Antje's answering questions and vice versa. Very, very powerful combination. Also, this is something Amazon is super into. This comes right from Jeff Bezos and his obsession with business books and studying how these other companies have scaled. And so create your own flywheel is the term. So we've actually really started with meetups and conferences just like this. We expanded, created the full 8-hour workshop. The 8-hour workshop led us to a book by the O'Reilly folks. And since then, we added this webinar to kind of keep this thing going. So we're learning at all stages here. And let me just make sure we got Luigi back in here. Yeah, okay. Yeah, we got Luigi here. Okay, so flywheel is very important. One thing, I had actually given this talk internally, so one of my tips to the other members of my team were don't rely on just the Amazon marketing team. They have, so much reach. They have quite a lot of reach, but really find your own channels. And so that's where you folks all come in, and people like Antje across the world have helped. Okay, so. Also minimize Q&A channels. This is something people always tend to go straight to Slack, and then they have Zoom chat and Slack chat, and you have email, and this could be mind-blowing. So one tip is just pick one channel, and they are all going to suck in some way. So just pick one, and you'll have one set of suckiness instead of multiple sets. Things to keep in mind are obviously Zoom chat. Is a little bit awkward. It's not, super nice, clean Q&A, but you can archive, and we actually export after each event. We export and feed it into the chatbot that Antje will show here in a minute. Slack also has this ability to export, so totally fine. One thing we found is at scale. So keep in mind, all these slides are about scaling the workshop. Yes, if you have 10 people, 20 people, 50 people, yes, that's not scale. Scale is hundreds, thousands. Keep in mind that the higher scale you go, the less number of people will be familiar with Slack. And while that seems crazy because of the business that we're in, Slack is pretty much universal. It's one more tool that will have some type of problem. and someone can't log in, they can't remember their password, their browser VPN doesn't allow it, their corporate doesn't let you install it on their laptop. Okay, number 4, this is a term I use all the time, keep things on rails. If you take them off of rails at scale and give people too many degrees of freedom, you will lose your mind. And so the sort of undertone here, right, like without actually putting it on the slide, is maintain control. And while you can encourage people to poke around and to try their own code snippets and try to rewrite things, really strive to keep things on rails. And here's something also that I believe in pretty heavily, which is always be testing. So there's this famous movie, Glenn Fiddich or something, and I believe that's Alec Baldwin, always be closing. I've adapted this to be always be testing. There's this famous business book, product management book called Hooked. If you haven't read this, I actually did the audio book recently, using Amazon Audible, quick plug there, great service. Hook people on these random rewards, show something different each time, always be testing, bring people back. This way, people that have already been through the workshop will start to learn new stuff. And so one of my idols, Jerry Garcia from the band The Grateful Dead, here in San Francisco. So they never played that same show twice. They always mixed it up. They always went with what they were working on at that moment, the sounds that they were exploring. So this is something Antje and I have been doing heavily. We bring snippets of that, like the chatbot, to you in this particular webinar to really test it out, and then we scale it out for the full day workshops. So number 6, if you can't measure something, you can't improve. We actually embed tracking pixels into all of our notebooks for the workshop. And this is so that we can see where people are spending time or where they're getting lost or which notebooks they're having problems with. And so we could actually go back and like replay people's sessions. And so this comes from another famous business book called The Effective Executive from Peter Drucker. Jeff Bezos is a huge fan of Peter Drucker. And so, yes, always be measuring, basically. A famous quote that my dad said, I remember as a child, was because I'd gone to visit his college campus, many years after he graduated, and I noticed that the campus actually had really odd sidewalks flowing through the campus. They weren't linear. And he said, oh, well, that's because this building is connected to this dorm, or is this is the shortest distance between this dorm and that building. And so they actually waited for the grass to get sort of worn out before they built the sidewalks. They realized when they built the sidewalks before, nobody used them because those weren't the optimal paths through the campus. So yeah, keep an eye on actually what people are using and take things out that people don't like or aren't feeling those samples. Okay, don't let negative feedback discourage you. Antje and I go through this every single time, just like any sort of Yelp reviews and things at scale, that there will always be negative reviews. Someone will always not like the approach you took, or they want their own use case covered. It's just not possible at scale. So yes, obviously try to aggregate this information, find hotspots, and fix if you think that it's something that you actually want to fix. And be open, of course, right? If there's enough people telling you that this is not a good use case to cover, this doesn't make any sense to like many people, then change the use case and focus on some other samples or add more samples. Keep in mind, if you add more samples, you are potentially taking things off of rails and starting to increase degrees of freedom. So find a good balance there. Take control of the sandbox. Something we use on the large scale events is this service called the Event Engine. I actually don't even know if this is a public service, so this might not totally apply to everyone. This might just be for the internal Amazon people right now. But this is a service that we use at big conferences like reInvent that has 400 or 500 people. Yes, we use this also. This basically creates these temporary sort of burner accounts. So these completely fresh, like Amazon accounts. Now, not all of you can do this, I understand this, but Try to stick to as clean of a fresh environment as possible. Don't expect to run on people's laptops. Don't expect to run in their cloud accounts. This works for 20 people. This does not work for hundreds, thousands of people. People's cloud accounts could have different whitelist rules, could have different like restrictions set up by their like IT. If they use their personal accounts, they might start up a service and then keep it running and then want you to pay their, $300 cloud bill at the end of the month. It's just a mess. So try to, if you can't spin up these fresh accounts, like we have this luxury, at least spin up one account and be able to spin up single instances, right? That you can tear down at the end. And of course, give the like attendees ways to pull down all of that data or make it, just put it out on GitHub. Keep the cost of the sandbox down, obviously. So know the cost. This is the first question that like everybody asks. We actually worked really hard over this past month to get the cost of the workshop down below $25. Which for us, for a full day workshop exploring, 15 different Amazon services in the like AI big data space, this is actually very good. Test in all regions at scale. We actually found some subtle differences. Well, there's some not so subtle, there's some very obvious differences, which is different instance types are supported, different services are supported. We found out the hard way that the Cape Town region within Amazon right now does not support SageMaker. That actually was kind of something that I didn't realize. I thought all the like regions supported everything. I don't know why I thought this. I just had many other things to think about for the workshop. Also, total capacity makes a difference. So we have to worry about this when we're scaling to thousands for these large events. There's also sometimes we found in very, very rare cases, there are certain of the like Python SDK bugs that assume certain regions, and this is not good. So we obviously go and fix these right away. We give that feedback to the product teams right to fix those bugs. But yeah, just keep in mind, if you are going to run in multiple regions, make sure that you test and run fully through. Sometimes the instance limits differ. We found out, I believe it's maybe the Mumbai region does not support the really, really tiny T2s. They only support the newer T3 like instance types, which isn't a big deal. They're much more cost efficient, but we actually didn't know that. And so that actually messed up some of our stuff. So we fixed all these since then, by the way. Have a backup plan. If you do need to make a fix on the fly, make it very easy for the attendees to do a quick git pull, and they'll be able to pull the fix. We have done this less than a handful of times, but when we've done it, it's kept people moving forward and it's saved things from being a complete and total disaster. So have that backup. Don't assume that the attendees will read the instructions. If you're given, if you go to someone's GitHub page or follow someone's instructions and you see big blocks of text and then little snippets of code, our eyes naturally go to the code. And we're just going to copy the code, boom, 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 boom. I can't tell you how many times this has burned me. We've had huge, huge warnings in big, bold letters. Make sure that you run this, double check this, triple check this. At the end of the day, use programmatic safeguards, use the actual SageMaker SDKs, the like Amazon SDKs to put in safeguards and stop the flow if someone has not run something previously. So we are always getting better with this. There's still cases where this happens. Also, update things right when the workshop is done. Usually Antje or I will be fixing things as we're going, or not necessarily fixing things, but we'll be smoothing over some of the speed bumps that we've noticed. If you don't check those in right away and you decide to go to dinner, or in like Antje's case, go to sleep at like 1 in the morning, you may forget what was that actual pain point. And so just fix it right away. It takes another 10, 15 minutes, just do the git push. And just get those thoughts in there. Yes, even if it's just a simple to-do, and then always be looking for the to-dos next time when you go to deliver it and smooth those out. Share your content. I can't say this enough. I've had friends of mine that have been doing these workshops, and they want to keep everything private and only give it to the people that come. And I've seen this many times over the last 10 years since I've been in the Bay Area. these people always, always, always end up making it open source, and that does attract more people and get people talking about it. So if you think it's going to cannibalize, this business model was actually made famous by the Grateful Dead back in the 60s and 70s, where they actually let all of these attendees, right, like record all of their music. And the like music studios hated this because they felt it would cannibalize record sales. And it actually had the opposite effect, where people went out and bought more. And so this goes back to try new content. Yes, always have something new. People will still come to the show if you're going to do something new and different and fun, and just share it and get that reach out there. Don't try to keep this stuff in. Okay, and also, so we've spawned from our workshop, we've had 5 community people that have actually spawned new workshops using our content. We're very excited about this. Use it, it's all public. All we want is for you to know the best practices and how to use SageMaker properly, how to use Athena, how to use EMR, all of the Spark on Amazon and SageMaker. We've also created 30 GitHub issues, things like those API bugs. Number 15, so this will be a nice segue into Antje's talk. Use a FAQ chatbot to handle these commonly repeated questions. Will this session be recorded? Is asked 500 times in a 8-hour period. And so not only do we get fatigued by answering the same question every time, this is very, very scriptable. And Antje here is going to show you how to do the FAQ with Lex and Kendra. So Antje, do you want to take it from here?
Sure. So let me quickly share my screen here. And I'll just kind of show you quickly the chatbot in action, because I think that's way more fun. So what we've done here, what Chris just showed on the slide, is actually try to find a smart way to offload all of those very common questions. And we've done this by building a chatbot here. So as you can see here, I'm in a Slack channel, and here is an app called Bird Reynolds, and it's a little pun intended. Actually, Chris is working on a little side project. He's a big country music fan. So he's working on a bird NLP model to produce country songs. So this is the little pun here, and I can type in here, "Hi there." And the chatbot replies, "Hello, how can I help?" And I can ask, like, "Do you record this workshop?" Right? Everyone is asking. And let's see, yeah, the workshop is being recorded. So great. So where do I get the recording? More important then. And let's see if I get an answer. The recording will be shared at YouTube Pipeline AI within a few days. Cool. So thanks. Happy I could help. So as you can see, this chatbot is actually helping us to address some of the common questions. And let me quickly show you how this works. And here's a blog post we can actually share here in the chat window with you. And this blog post highlights how you can build a smart FAQ. And it's based on mainly two services from AWS. It's Amazon Kendra and Amazon Lex. So if you're not familiar with, Amazon Lex is a chatbot service and Kendra is an enterprise search. So what we're doing here is basically, let me scroll down here to the image, is creating a chatbot with a Lex interface, which is able to react on intents, on utterances it sees, and replies back with answers. And if there's a question that it can't handle, it can actually pass it on to Amazon Kendra, which is an enterprise search service, which is able to index documents. So let me quickly show you. So if I hop in here quickly here in the AWS console to Kendra, you can create an index and provide a data source, which is an S3 bucket, where you can upload documents. So for example, you can upload developer guides, user guides, whatever you need to do. And then you're able to basically pull out answers from those documents that are stored in here. So what I've done here, I created a data source which has a couple of SageMaker developer guides. And I also do have an FAQ document which has a couple of the common workshop questions, like, is this being recorded, etc. So this is how you can build a bot, and then Lex is basically the interface. So in Lex, you can basically create those chatbot intents. So for example, if I type a hi there, you can see it's recognized as an hello intent. And then we're replying here with hello, how can I help? And this is pretty easy, couple of steps here to create this. And then what I did, I deployed it as a Slack application here. So those were the simple questions. And if I type a question, for example, do you know how to get started with Amazon SageMaker? This is one question where the bot would go back to Kendra and pull up here a document that I uploaded, SageMaker developer guide, and finds the right section in the document that it thinks matches the answer. So here, for example, it found a part in this document saying for SageMaker Studio, get started, choose quick start. So it seems to be exactly how to get started. And yeah, this is what we put together the last couple of days. Just an exciting little workshop bot to answer some of those questions. And with that, I'll hand over back to Chris, and we're going to check if Luigi has the microphone settled, not to steal his thunder for the rest of the workshop today.
Cool. Thanks, Antje. Good work. I think you started that yesterday morning and stabilized it by today, which was awesome. So good job there. Luigi, how's your mic?
I hope it's working better. Can you hear me?
Yeah, perfect. Excellent, man. Grab the screen share and introduce yourself and talk about, yeah, so like whatever you want. I'm going to record until you're done. So if we have to go over, that's totally fine.
Sure. Can you see my screen?
Sure can. Yep.
All right, excellent. Let me just move this over to my laptop here so I can have the other panel open. All right, excellent. So sorry about the mic issue earlier on. For some reason, I have a pretty high quality mic that I use for calls, and that one sounds robotic, but my laptop mic is going to have to settle for the call today. So my name is Luigi Petruno. I'm the Director of Data Science at a company called 2U. It's an educational technology company. And what I do there is lead a team of data scientists and machine learning engineers building predictive models, predictive services, and infrastructure for those things. But outside of my role as the Director of Data Science, I also run a blog called mlinproduction.com, which is focused on best practices for building real-world production systems. I write there quite frequently, so if you'd like to subscribe to that blog to get updates, please do. For the purposes of this call, what I want to talk about is one area of production machine learning systems that are often not talked about, and that is how to actually deploy new versions of your machine learning models or services. So I put together a repository with all of the code and the actual presentation that I'm doing. So I'll just copy and paste that into the chat so you can have access to it. And in case I'm unable to get through all of the content, you can just go through it on your own. So that GitHub link is in the chat now. And the main interface we'll be using is just Jupyter Lab, which I'm running on SageMaker Studio, the SageMaker Studio instance. And basically all of the content I'll be reviewing is in a single notebook called rollout.ipynb. That's in the root of the GitHub repository. So just open up that notebook if you'd like to follow along. Otherwise, we'll just discuss it in this call. And please just, oh, the name of my website. Chris, would you mind just throwing that into the blog, into the chat?
Yep.
So thanks. So the name of the presentation is how to roll out machine learning services using Amazon SageMaker. And just a little bit about myself. As I mentioned, I founded mlinproduction.com. I'm the Director of Data Science at 2U. And I really consider myself what I call a full stack ML engineer. And what I mean by that is I've really worked up and down the entire sort of end-to-end machine learning workflow. I've been a data scientist, an individual contributing data scientist. I've been an individual contributing ML engineer, and I've also worked as a data engineer on things like ETLs and data pipelines. And really what I'd like to focus on is the product. So I'm really product driven. I don't really care about methodology. If I can solve the majority of the problem with a linear regression, I will do that over using something more complex. And if you'd like, you can reach out to me on Twitter at mlinproduction. So before I get into the actual implementation part of the discussion, I just want to start off with a little bit of context and background. And from there, we'll actually talk about how to implement several different deployment strategies using the SageMaker API. Namely, the ones that we're going to discuss are canary deployments and blue-green deployments. And the SageMaker API makes it really easy for you to use these different deployment strategies with your machine learning services. But what some people don't know, or even what I discovered, is that you can't actually do that if you're using the SageMaker Python SDK in its current form. You actually have to use the Boto 3 SDK and the SageMaker client in the Boto 3 SDK in order to sort of do this easily. So what we'll walk through is the code for actually implementing canary deployments and blue-green deployments. And I've actually already run that code. And the reason I did that is because it takes some amount of time for the underlying infrastructure to spin up when you make these API calls. So I went ahead and did that ahead of time and just saved the output to the notebook so we can walk through what the output actually is. So if you have any questions, please just feel free to shoot them out in the chat or Q&A, and I'll have Chris sort of poke me when there is a good question for me to answer. So let's start with the actual deployment strategies for the ML services. And there's really 4 deployment strategies that I want to call out. One is a single deployment. The other is what I call silent intelligence. Then there's a controlled rollout, and there's flighting. So let me zoom in a little bit so you can see the text on my screen a little bit better. Hopefully that's better. And let's start out with the single deployment. And the single deployment is actually really simple, right? Let's suppose you have some machine learning service where users interact with some system, and then this system generates some prediction based on contextual data. When you have a single deployment and you're rolling out a new version of your model, all you're actually doing is taking that new service and introducing it to all your users at the same time, right? And this is really simple. There's nothing complex here. And the pros of this approach is that it's super simple to manage and very easy to implement, right? Suppose you have one version of your machine learning service working, something like a recommendation system, and you want to deploy your new change. What the single deployment approach does is just roll out delete the previous version and now deploy the new version to all your users. So what are the cons of this approach? Well, it's totally unforgiving, right? If there are any problems in your new ML service, they're going to be seen by all of your users all at once. So there's a high downside to this approach. But it can be really effective when you have a really well-developed offline test suite that catches problems. The issues occur when, if an error does occur, it has a high cost associated with it, and your ability to respond to an error is quite slow, right? So typically when companies that have sort of immature data science practices or new data science teams start deploying new models, they typically take this single deployment approach. And I will be honest, I've taken this approach many times. And it's not until you sort of run into errors with this approach that you learn that you need to do something different. And the next sort of iteration on rolling out a new version of your model is what's called silent intelligence. Other people also know this as deploying your machine learning models in shadow mode. So what is this approach really? So when you deploy a new machine learning service in parallel to the existing service, and you just run both versions of your models for every interaction. However, you only show your users the predictions of the machine learning services that have already been running and been verified to work. The whole point of this is that you've rolled out a new service in parallel, but it doesn't affect users. So what you're able to do is just generate predictions from that service and log them for analysis, right? And it's helpful to examine the predictions from this shadow mode deployment to determine if the new ML service is making predictions that are different from your previous service. And this gives you the ability to gain a lot of confidence in your new system. So you basically have both versions deployed. One version is actually serving responses to users, and one version is just logging responses for essentially an offline analysis where you can compare the results. And when you have the system running, you can really run it for as long as you need. So suppose you deployed your new system and you just want to run it for a day, or you want to run it for a week, or you want to run it for a month. That's fine. You can do that because it's working. And once you gain that confidence in the new machine learning service, in your new model, then you can switch over all of the users to see that new version of your model. So when is this sort of silent deployment or shadow mode deployment effective? Well, even if you have a really well-developed offline test suite and you want to get an additional quote unquote online check on the quality of the service or models, you should use this. And what do I mean by online check? Well, I mean actually testing in production. However, we're not really testing in production because people aren't seeing the results of your model, but you're able to log those and monitor what's happening. You're able to monitor to see the accuracy of the models, and you're also able to monitor to see whether or not the system is responding within the latency that you need it to. And this is effective when you want to just confirm that the model generalizes as well as you previously thought. So when is this problematic? Well, if you don't want the complexity or cost of running multiple services, then this may not be the approach that you want to take. If you can't afford the latency cost of running multiple models, then you probably won't want to do this, but you can get around this by making those calls to the new service asynchronous or enforcing some timeout on those API calls, right? So suppose you're running both models sort of concurrently, you don't want the service that's actually responding to users to be blocked by the service that you're testing, right? And you can have them both running, but just operate the testing service sort of asynchronously. And finally, if it's hard to evaluate the effect of your new models without exposing them to users, then silent deployments are not going to work for you. For example, suppose that you really need to observe a user outcome once they see the results of the prediction, then deploying in shadow mode won't really do anything for you because you're not going to be able to observe those user responses since you're just logging the predictions to the backend. So the third is what we're going to call the controlled rollout. And here you deploy the new version of your machine learning service, and you then divert a fraction of your user traffic to it. So suppose you deploy the new service, and you start off by sending 1% of your total traffic to that new model or that new service. And once you verify that it's working as expected on that 1% of data, you might start to scale that up and go to 5% of your user base, and to 10%, and to 25%, et cetera, et cetera. And what this allows you to do is slowly control the fraction of your user base that's seeing the new machine learning models and services, right? And how you can, and the free parameter here is sort of how many of your users should see this new service, right? And that is totally a domain dependent question, right? And the way to respond to that is to sort of balance what you need in terms of latency and safety. If it's safe to expose more users to the new model, and by safe, I really mean, limiting the downside as in an error isn't very costly, then you might want to roll it out to more users sooner. However, if the cost of an error is quite high, you might want to be more conservative and just roll it out to a smaller fraction of your user base and see how it performs on those users. Right? So this is effective when you want to see how users are going to respond to your new machine learning models whilst controlling for the amount of possible damage that can occur. All right. And it's also effective when you're willing to let some of your users experience problems to help you verify the new service. Right? If you don't want anyone to experience problems, then this might still not be a good approach for you. When is this problematic? Well, again, if you can't run multiple things at the same time, or if that's too costly, then this won't work for you. And also, if you're worried about rare events, this may not work for you. And what I mean by rare events is, suppose you only roll out to 1% of your audience or to your user base. However, you're really trying to determine what will happen in 1% of the total time because of some extremely rare event, then you probably won't catch that with a controlled rollout. And finally, the last thing I want to mention is what's called flighting. And people will often refer to this as just A/B testing, right? And what this is it's a special type of controlled rollout, essentially, where you want to be able to make causal claims about some outcome. So you serve different versions of your machine learning models or services to different parts of your user population. You record the results, and then you can perform a statistical test in order to determine whether one version of your model generates the user outcome more effectively than another version of your model, right? And one, flighting is a more general thing, but one version of flighting is just called A/B testing. And I've written a blog post on how to effectively A/B test machine learning models, and I've linked to it directly in the notebook. So if you want to check out that post, you can just click on A/B testing, and it'll take you to the blog post that I wrote. And that blog post is part of a much larger blog post series I wrote specifically on the topic of deploying machine learning models. It's a topic that's not really well discussed or well understood, and I've written a 10-part blog series really in depth on all of the potential issues that can arise when you're deploying your machine learning models. So back to this sort of topic. When is flighting effective? Well, if you have a large number of small changes and you want to determine which one works best, then you should perform flighting or A/B testing. And if you want to track changes over an extended period of time so that you can make statistically valid statements about one thing impacting another thing and generating some outcome, then you'll want to perform flighting. However, it is problematic when you need to iterate quickly or when the differences that you're trying to measure are very small, because that will necessitate that you run this sort of experiment for a long time. Right, so these are 4 different approaches to rolling out new machine learning models and services that are sort of ordered in terms of increasing complexity, right? A single deployment is very simple. You just knock out the previous service and you put out the new service. Shadow modes are a little bit more complex than that. Controlled rollouts are more complex than that. And flighting is, I would say, significantly more complex than those previous 2. Now, if you're trying to implement this on your own, this is extremely complicated, especially if you're sort of asking your data science team to do this. And the reason it's complicated is because it involves a lot of knowledge about infrastructure, web applications, networking configurations that a data science team typically does not have, nor should spend the time on acquiring, right? If you have a DevOps team and a traditional sort of back-end software engineering team that can help you, that makes it more possible, but there still is a complicated coordination cost to get all of these teams working effectively together. But when SageMaker sort of added additional functionality, they made it extremely easy to implement some of these rollout strategies using just straight up API requests to the SageMaker API, right? And the way they went about doing this is these specific objects that are part of SageMaker, specifically endpoint and endpoint config options. So what I want to talk about now is how to actually go about implementing canary deployments and blue-green deployments, which are not exactly the rollout strategies that we've described, but can allow you to configure these rollout strategies, right? So before we actually go into showing how to implement both blue-green deployments and canary deployments, I just have this setup part of the notebook. And what the setup part of the notebook does at a high level is upload some training data to S3 and train a few different versions of a machine learning model, and then deploy both of those versions of the model as API endpoints on SageMaker. So before I continue, I'll just pause and ask Chris if I should answer any questions or if I should just keep going through.
Yeah, there was a question here about guidance here. What's the recommended way to split or duplicate your data between real and shadow mode in SageMaker? Yeah, between the like actual model and the shadow model.
Sure, awesome question. So if you're doing this shadow model approach, really the best thing you want to do is send 100% of your data to both things, to both versions. However, you only want to respond to the user with the predictions from the real quote unquote model, right? The point of the shadow model is just to generate predictions and to store those in the backend. So ideally, if you have predictions from both sets of machine learning services, you can perform an offline analysis to compare the results and see how the new version, the quote unquote shadow version, did as compared to the real version. Does that make sense?
Yeah, and Stuart, a longtime fan of our series here, is asking, of the four options, wouldn't it be better to capture the metadata driving an existing model and replay this? So I guess, yeah, replay, and then compare the two versions. This is the approach he prefers. Capturing metadata used by model allows you to see metadata patterns. Any thoughts?
I'm not sure what Stuart means by replay this. I think if there was a little bit of clarification, I'd be happy to answer, but I'm not quite sure what he means by that.
Yeah, I'll give it a shot, Stuart, if you also want to type it in here. Also, can you type it into all panelists and the attendees? Other people can see it here. I guess, this is something we did at like Netflix for a bit until we went to this shadow model kind of thing where we actually offline replayed. So we would capture data and then simulate it before even going to production. Therefore, you don't actually affect anyone.
Sure. So in terms of logging the input data, you should always be logging your input data, right? So even if you have one version of your model, you should be logging the inputs and the outputs. And now I think what you're saying is using that data that you've already logged, can you just simulate the outputs into a new version by just running those previously logged inputs into your new version of the model? Is that clear? Yes, okay, that's what you're saying. So that is one possible approach, but this is still an offline approach, right? And you're essentially only understanding how the model would have performed on historical data. One thing we can be sure of is that things are going to change over time. And if you want to be able to sort of check on cases that aren't stored in your historical data, you're going to need to run them, run the models live. So that's sort of one difference, right? Looking at cases that you haven't previously seen in your historical data sets. And another thing is you can't really understand the performance of your overall system unless you have you've really invested in duplicating the overall system. What I mean by that is you want to do some load balance testing, right? See how your system will perform if you're going to increase the number of requests to it by some sort of factor. And doing something like a shadow mode deployment allows you to do that load testing in production. Does that make sense? Cool. Yeah. So Stuart. Good question, Stuart. So I'll move on for now, and we'll sort of let some additional questions queue up for the end of the talk. So we have about 15 minutes left in the call. So I will skip through the sections that I think are sort of self-explanatory, or I'll just give some simple explanations of those. So what I'm doing in the setup section here, as I mentioned, is uploading some data sets to S3, training 2 predictive models, and I'm just training some XGBoost models on some churn data to predict customer churn. I'm then deploying these models as API endpoints using the SageMaker Python SDK. And the last thing I'll do is view the endpoint and endpoint config details from the deployment. So I'll just actually skip ahead to that part because the first part is, again, just training some data sets, training some models, excuse me. And at this stage, I just call the deploy method on these model objects in order to create endpoints. And what the deploy method does from the Python SDK is actually a few things. First of all, it creates a model object that SageMaker can access, but it also creates a few other objects. Specifically, it creates an endpoint and an endpoint config for each sort of version of the model that you call deploy on. And I've given these endpoints and endpoint names config. And in the first case, I'm just calling one endpoint model A and the other endpoint model B. And I'm calling the models themselves model A and model B. So the first thing we'll want to do is actually describe the endpoint and get a sense of an understanding of what sort of metadata is saved with these endpoints. So what I'm doing here is calling describe endpoint, which again is a method on the Bodo 3 SageMaker client. And I'm describing endpoints for model A that I've created. And what we'll want to focus on here is this production variance section or key. And what production variance tells us is which models are actually being used to generate predictions. And if there are multiple models, what fraction of the total traffic is that single variant seeing? So when you just deploy when you call deploy on a single model, you're going to get an endpoint with one production variant, right? And that production variant is going to be getting 100% of the traffic. And we can see that here by seeing the variant's name here is called all traffic, and it's getting 1.0, which really means 100% of all of the data. So this is describing the endpoint. Now we can also describe the endpoint configuration object. So doing that is basically just as simple. We call describe endpoint config. And what that shows us, again, we'll get a production variance key within the API response. And we'll see the model that's being used. We'll see that all traffic is being sent to that model, as well as some information about the instance that's on the EC2 instance that's underlying that model, and the percentage of the traffic when the percentage of traffic being diverted to that model. So we've described the endpoint, we've described the endpoint config, and finally we can also describe the model. And the model is literally the actual serialized model that's being used for inference. So 3 things I've described is the endpoint config, and the model object. What I do in the next 3 cells is go through the same thing for endpoint model B. So I'll just skip ahead for that. Well, basically you'll see similar information. Now let's talk about blue-green deployments. And I think we won't have time to go through everything, but I'll at least go through a blue-green deployment and just discuss how you can do the same thing with a canary deployment. Again, all of the code is contained within this notebook. So in a blue-green deployment, you start with your users basically just seeing one version of some service. In this case, this is a machine learning-based service. And what you'll want to do then is create, and that's called the blue version, right? The current version that users are seeing. You'll then want to create a second deployment, call this the green deployment, and essentially test out that the green deployment operates as you would like it to, right? And this is very similar to the idea of deploying your models in shadow mode. You create the second service, but you just test on it. And once you gain the confidence that this green deployment is working as you would like, you switch out your traffic and divert it to the green version. And once you've done that, you can finally delete the previous version. All right, so this is essentially, you start with one working version, you create another, but you do not divert your traffic to it. You just test out how the service is working. Once you've gained confidence in that, you switch over your traffic to that green version, and then you delete the previous version. Right? And maybe rather than deleting the previous version, you keep it around for some amount of time so that you can revert to it if you do need. Now, this is just a general sort of figure. This says nothing about SageMaker, but we can look at how to implement a blue-green deployment specifically with SageMaker, right? And we can talk specifically in terms of the objects that SageMaker utilizes. So we start with our blue deployment, in which case, imagine a machine learning service that's currently in production. We then replace the endpoint configuration with a new endpoint configuration with 2 production variants. However, 100% of the traffic will be diverted to the blue deployment, and 0% of the traffic will be diverted to the green deployment. Once you're done testing on the green deployment, you switch over traffic entirely to the green deployment, and then you replace your endpoint config again and just divert 100% of your traffic to the green deployment and don't even have the blue version running anymore. All right. And what we'll walk through next is just the API calls you can run to perform a blue-green deployment. Now, these figures are from a really well-written white paper that Amazon released recently called the AWS Machine Learning Lens. And I've linked to that post in the references section of this notebook. So you can go ahead and read through that. I really recommend it if you're using SageMaker in production. And let's just walk through implementing these steps really quickly. So these are the steps you actually have to go through. The first is to create an endpoint with a single production variant. Next, you'll create a new endpoint configuration using the same production variants from the existing live model and for the new model that you want to deploy. You'll then update the existing live endpoint with the new endpoint configuration. And behind the scenes, SageMaker will go ahead and create all of the required infrastructure without any downtime for your existing service. So users can continue to use the service as is without, without running into any issues. You'll then generate an API call to switch traffic to the new model. And finally, you'll create a new endpoint configuration with only the new production variant and apply it to the endpoint. So I see a good question that I just want to call out really quickly. Are there any existing books or resources to learn deployment? So I actually just literally today opened up my online course specifically on how to deploy models and monitor them using SageMaker. And I have a link to that at the bottom of this course. So, and I'll be offering a discount to people in this call. So there's some resources available. So to quickly walk through this, the first thing we're going to do is create an endpoint with just a single production variant. And to do that, we call the create endpoint function. And we pass it an endpoint name, which I'm just calling churn model, and an endpoint config. And I'm using the previously created endpoint config from the model A that I deployed. And this returns 200, meaning that the endpoint has been created. And when I call describe endpoint and look at the production variants, I see that 100% of the traffic is being diverted to the model A. So this is essentially corresponds to this first panel in the plot where all traffic is going to the blue deployment. Can you share the link in Discord code to the workshop? Absolutely. I'll do that right after this explanation. And in fact, the link is already contained in the notebook. And the discount code is ML in production for 10% off of the already discounted early bird price. The link is at the bottom of the notebook. So after creating the endpoint, the second thing we're going to do is create a new endpoint config. And what we're going to do is send 100% of the traffic to model A and 0% of the traffic to model B. So as we can see, all we need to do this is create two dictionaries. And in the first dictionary, we're pointing to model A. We're calling this variant blue. And here I'm just saying I want one EC2 instance of type T2 medium. And I'm sending 100% of the traffic to it. And in variant B, I'm using model B. I'm calling this the green version of the deployment, specifying the EC2 instance types and sending 0% of traffic to model B, right? And what I'll first need to do is actually first create the endpoint configuration and give it a name. And I'm just calling that the blue-green endpoint configuration. So once I call create endpoint config, it returns a 200 OK, and we can look at we can describe it. And once we describe it, we see that it's called blue-green and has two production variants. This is the first time we've looked at two production variants with 100% of the traffic going to model A and 0% going to model B. And finally, to actually use this new endpoint configuration, we have to call update endpoint and give it the new endpoint configuration, right? And once we do that, we can describe the endpoint and see that there are now two production variants with 100% of the traffic going to the blue version and 0% going to the green version. If we scroll back up, we see that that's the second panel in the figure. Now, in order to go to the third panel, all we need to do is update our endpoint config and just change the fraction of the users that see which model. So scrolling back down, that is step 4, switch traffic to the new model with an API call. And all we need to do is we can actually call an additional method, just update endpoint weights and capacities. And all we have to do is just pass it the fraction of traffic that we want to switch over to the green deployment. And once we do that, we can describe the endpoint again and see that the blue version is now seeing 0% of traffic and the green version is now seeing 100% of traffic. All right, and the last thing we'll want to do is sort of remove the blue deployment entirely. And we can do that by updating the endpoint and passing it the endpoint configuration that does not include the blue deployment whatsoever. And we can describe that endpoint and see here now that we've deleted the blue version entirely and we're sending all traffic to Model A. So we only have a few minutes left, so I'll just stop there. I've also gone through Canary deployment, which is quite similar, except that you slowly move over traffic from the blue version to the green version. And again, I've included all the code for doing that below, as well as a description of it, so you can go through it on your own. But I will say, for those interested, first of all, I've included a bunch of references here on these topics, really in-depth resources, so please feel free to go through them. And if you want to learn more, you can enroll in my new course, and the link for that new course is right here in the notebook. And use code ML in production to get 10% off of the course. Right now, I'm running an early bird sale for the next 2 weeks. That's already a significant amount of money off the course. So if you throw the ML in production code, you get an additional 10% off of the early bird discount. And I'll be teaching a version of the course. You can use the course sort of in a pre-recorded way, but you can also register to take the course with me, sort of with a virtual in-person component where I'll field questions from students. So I'll just leave it there. I know that was a bit rushed, but unfortunately I had some mic problems earlier on. So I hope this was really interesting and really useful for people.
Yeah, great stuff, Luigi. Yes, as I mentioned in the chat, I took this course a couple months ago, and it was awesome. I learned quite a bit, and I had already been with Amazon for about 6 months at the time. So yeah, Luigi knows his stuff. That's why we love him. That's why we have him on here. I think someone asked about model monitoring. Maybe you could just show us. I know you covered that in the workshop.
Yeah, so I have a whole chapter on model monitoring in the course where we look specifically at creating schedules that compare the distributions of the data that you're observing on live data to the distributions of data used for training and visualize concept drift. So that's 100% covered in the course, and that's extremely important. I mean, I think the two most important parts about building machine learning systems is, well, three most important is defining your problem really well and getting business buy-in. 2 is deployment, and 3 is monitoring, because monitoring is the only way that you can actually catch issues and that affect your end users.
Cool. And do you have that GitHub notebook, or is that something in the workshop?
The notebook for the workshop that you attended?
For the model monitor.
Oh,
so
sure.
Just in case you wanted to see that.
Yeah, I can open up the repo for the workshop.
Oh yeah.
As you mentioned, the code base and the notebooks for my course are all brand new, much cleaner than those for the workshop. And I'll be, if you register for the course, you get access to that. So these are the code bases. This is the code base for the previous workshop. And if you want to see specifically about model monitoring, here is a notebook on model monitoring. And if anybody has any questions, please feel free to shoot me a message on Twitter, or you can email me, and I'll include my email address. It's just luigi@mlinproduction.com. Always happy to chat. I love talking about this stuff, so please feel free to message me regardless of your level of experience.
Great. I think we answered most of the questions here. I guess a couple questions coming up about on-premise, outside of Amazon. How would you do this? I just mentioned KubeFlow. There's a couple projects called KF Serving and Selden, specific to KubeFlow. Any other thoughts on sort of on-premise, Luigi?
On-premise, I know that I've built out my own ML platform at a few different companies. There are a few different vendors that provide on-premise capabilities. One that I believe, no, I don't want to give a sort of wrong information. I will say that the vendor space is quite huge, and there are companies that specifically do on-prem, but I'm not very well versed in them because I always rely on cloud services.
Yep. Okay, and we'll be posting to youtube.pipeline.ai, and I'll also send you a copy, Luigi, so you can post it to your YouTube channel. You can, cut it up how you want. And yeah, someone mentioned Algorithmia. Yes, they do have on-premise. I know they are Kubernetes based. They also work with the cloud providers as well. And I think that's it. Maybe one more minute for questions here, and then I want to give everyone back their morning here, or day, or evening. Okay. Excellent, Luigi. Thanks so much, buddy.
Yeah, really enjoyed it. Thanks for having me.
Okay. Send you the video later this afternoon or tomorrow.
Awesome. Have a good day, night, everybody.
Bye.
Thanks, everyone. Bye-bye.